Welcome everyone for joining us tonight. I'm sure I have at least one thing in common with all of those of you who attended the first day of the conference on intelligent design at the castle, at the beautiful castle. And that is the impression that the speeches and speakers were very stimulating and engaging. But also probably some of us, still have questions, still have doubts on a few implications and things that were said today. So I think it is a privilege for all of us to be in this room tonight and having the possibility to continue at least some of the discussion we heard today, counting on two refined gentlemen and fine scholars who are available for my questions, your questions. We will have a Q&A session at the end, so everyone can stand up to the mic and put questions. And we want to thank Fundacja En Arche, if my Polish pronunciation is correct, but anyway, En Arche Foundation, for making this event this evening possible, and personally for giving me the privilege to sit by our guest tonight, which without further ado, I will introduce you. You met them, most of you met them today, but I want to remember you and then giving them what is theirs. We have Dr. Douglas X, Maxwell Professor of Molecular Biology at Biola University, the founding director of Biological Institute, the founding editor of Biocomplexity, and the author of the book Undeniable: How Biology Confirms Our Intuition That Life is Designed. His research, which examines the functional and structural constraints on the evolution of proteins and protein systems, has been featured in many scientific journals, including the Journal of Molecular Biology, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, Biocomplexity, and Nature. And in such books as Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt by Stephen Meyer and Life's Solution by Simon Conway Morris. At my extreme left, Dr. Brian Miller, Research Coordinator and Senior Fellow for the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute. He speaks internationally on the topics of intelligent design and helps manage the ID 3.0 research program, having been a primary organizer of the Conference on Engineering in the Life Sciences. He has contributed to multiple books and journals covering the debate over intelligent design, including The Mystery of Life's Origin, The Continuing Controversy, The Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith, and Inference Review. He is a regular contributor to Evolution News and Science Today and the ID the Future podcast. So we, as I said briefly, we have the right people to put hopefully the right questions. As to me, I am a journalist working in Italy. I'm an Italian. I'm an Italian citizen. I work as a journalist, and I am the vice president of the Centro Italiano per l'Intelligent Design, Italian Center for Intelligent Design. And the only reason why I'm the vice president there and why I'm here tonight is because I have questions. Not everything is clear to me as to intelligent design. Not everything is already solved. So I'm the most interested person in this room tonight to gather some, answers or details or some nuances on a few things, and I want to start from the beginning, really, literally, talking about the argument of the primordial soap, as they call it. Proponents of ID, of intelligent designs, say that this hypothesis or theory, as someone calls it, is no longer valid as a scientific argument. Nonetheless, evolutionary biologists says that, catalytic RNAs appeared by chance on early Earth as molecular replicators that gradually evolve into complex molecules capable of encoding proteins, metabolic systems, and ultimately DNA. But one of the most intriguing and, at my knowledge, not addressed completely argument is the famous Miller-Urey experiment, and which says, you probably know it perfectly, that under some right condition, organic molecules could have spontaneously formed from inorganic prosecutors. And so the origin of life is just a random process from the material world to more elaborate systems. I find this rather challenging, if not convincing. We find it in textbooks, we find it everywhere. How can you respond to that? I mean, you proponents of ID just challenge that directly. I forgot to say the rules, but it's quite easy. More or less 10 to 15 minutes for question. I put my question to both of you, and you can also interject and put questions one to the other.
Sure.
Certainly.
So you start. Whatever.
Yeah, so this is really my specialty because I studied complex systems physics at Duke University. I have a PhD. And I found that origin of life researchers would often appeal to my field. They'd talk about self-organization and suggest that these processes would help explain life's origin. The problem is, when origin of life researchers go to the laboratory, they assume that life must have originated through natural processes. So what they do is they create the best story they can, and they'll go into a lab and, like the Miller-Urey experiment, they took certain gases on the early Earth, they applied electricity, and then they produced certain molecules that were useful for life, specifically a few amino acids and some other molecules. The problem is, whenever they do this research, they simply look at the positives and not the negatives, because they assume life must have originated through a natural process. They just cherry pick the data that fits, and they ignore the data that doesn't fit. So with the Miller-Urey experiment, and with all such experiments, you do produce some molecules useful for life, but they're always surrounded by a large number of other molecules that are not useful for life. So, as Doug Axe talked about, one of the most important molecules for life are proteins. And examples of proteins would be enzymes. And they consist of smaller molecules called amino acids that are in a chain, a chain of amino acids that create a sequence with a specific order that fold into a protein. The problem is, if you have amino acids surrounded by many, many other molecules, the amino acids will almost always combine with a biologically useless molecule and not combine to themselves. So at that point, all origin of life researchers come to an end. That's where it ends, because it's a physical impossibility to separate the molecules you want away from everything else. But what happens is, you mentioned sort of the RNA that are supposed to do certain functions useful for life. Well, the researchers don't start with the output of the first experiment. They'll buy nucleotides, which are the building blocks of RNA, and RNA is like DNA, except they're slightly different molecules, in high concentrations, high purities. Then they'll have a highly orchestrated set of steps to put these molecules together. Nothing remotely similar could happen on the early Earth. If you took their experiment and dumped it into a thermal vent or a prebiotic soup, they would just break apart. The way they're able to have molecules that are RNAs do something useful is they provide the information. They'll create a long string of nucleotides as an RNA. They'll borrow the machinery of life to help do this very often. They'll make sure it has the right sequence to do the right thing. But even that's not enough. So to have this long RNA molecule do something useful, they have to literally make trillions of copies of it, put it into a small container, and then let it do what it normally does. The problem is on the early Earth, there's no chance you would ever get a molecule that long. And even if you did, there's almost no chance it would do anything useful. You have to supply the information. But even if it did, there's simply no way you're going to be able to get millions, let alone trillions of copies of these long molecules with the right sequences in a local location. So all these claims about the success simply reflects the brilliance of the chemists, because it was the chemist's intervention, creating the molecules, concentrating the molecules, that allowed them to do anything interesting, and it's not something that has any relevance to what could have happened on the early Earth.
Well put.
Any more thought?
Yes, let me just say, if we bump up to a level and sort of analyze the philosophy behind this, there's a thought experiment about a monkey typing Shakespeare, and that if you give a monkey a typewriter, a monkey will never be able to type Shakespeare. And that's true. Now, in effect, what these scientists have done is they throw a party every time a monkey types one or two letters that could be combined to make a line of Shakespeare. And the problem with that is the entire difficulty of this is the combining. So to get a little thing and then another little thing here and another little thing here, and then say, these things are all found in life, is sleight of hand, because the whole difficulty is in the combining of all these things to make even the simplest living cell. And nothing that has been produced in these experiments comes anywhere close to that.
Are you implying that the Miller-Urey experiment is not well-done science? Because I'm putting this question because my second child in Italy is studying medicine, and he's studying that experiment as a proof of, just the contrary of what you say.
It's very well done science. It's just the way it's interpreted is not accurate. In fact, even the people that developed the experiment years later talked about how they were a little bit disappointed with how little progress has been made in the field. Because what does the experiment produce? It produces amino acids, and that's exactly what they wanted to do, so that's great. What's not accurate is to claim that this demonstrates the plausibility of life forming because those amino acids were surrounded by other molecules. And if you talk to an honest origin of life researcher, like a great example is Stephen Benner. Stephen Benner is one of the leading origin of life researchers in the world. He has a Harvard pedigree. He wrote a paper called Paradoxes in the Origin of Life. He said, and again, I think he's an atheist or agnostic, so he assumes that life must have originated through natural process. He's as knowledgeable about the field as anybody else. He says that everything we know about physics and chemistry, particularly thermodynamics, demonstrates that a chemical system will always move away from life, never towards it, towards uselessly complex mixtures. That's his words. And that's what you see in the Miller-Urey experiment, is that you apply energy to organic molecules and some other molecules, and what do you get? A very, very complex mixture, and you can never move forward. The hope, originally, back when it was first done, was that somebody else would eventually show how you could isolate what you want and then move the steps forward. That has not happened. So the research is excellent research. It's just the interpretation of the results are through the lens of faith. They assume that life must have originated through natural process. So they see this as one small step in that direction, and they overlook the rest of the results that show how it's actually moving in the wrong direction.
Can I just clarify? When Brian says complex mixture, he means a mess. He doesn't mean something complex like life. So it lacks the sort of a complexity that life has. It's a mess, is what we mean. And also, of the 20 amino acids required for life, you get only a very small fraction from Miller-Urey. You get very simple, small amino acids. Life only uses left-handed amino acids. You get a mixture of left and right-handed amino acids, so it's a disaster, really.
You mentioned proteins just a few seconds ago. Let's talk about functional proteins. First of all, if you can just give us a simple and short definition of what they are and how they work, plus addressing the debate between proponents of ID and evolutionary biologists. The first ID proponents say they are very rare and special, and evolutionary biologists just say the contrary. They are not that special. They are not. They obey to some purely mechanical, naturalistic mechanism. Can you, as I said, please give a short explanation, definition, how they work, and what about this debate on the right side? I'm confused.
So proteins are one example of what are called macromolecules, or very big molecules in life. Unlike DNA, DNA is A, C, G, and T in long sequences. Protein chains are, I refer to them as the pearl necklace today. 20 amino acids linked together in long chains, and if they have the right properties, those chains fold and form well-formed structures, and if it's the right structure, it performs a function. So that's what a protein is.
Now, one thing it's really important to realize that the debate about design and life and about proteins is very different if you talk to experts in the field versus reading the blogs of, let's say, atheists. So that's very important. So you can't believe everything you read on the internet. You really have to talk to people that are intellectually honest and understand the science. Because to clarify the issue, there are different types of proteins. So many, many proteins, probably most proteins, and Doug Axe can talk more about this, are very, very rare. And experts in the field, like Andreas Wagner, would acknowledge that fact. But what people do is they talk about the simplest, easiest proteins, which are less rare, as you'd expect. But it'd be kind of like this. Imagine I told you I could teach a dog to play Mozart on a piano at the level of a concert pianist. You would be skeptical, right? And if I told you I can prove it to you, because I'm going to teach my dog how to catch a stick in a day. Well, they're both functions in a sense, they're both tricks, but there's a qualitative difference between playing Mozart on a piano and catching a stick. So Doug Axe and people like myself talk about the proteins that perform more complex functions, the ones that are very, very rare, while our critics will focus on these very, very simple proteins that perform very, very simple functions. The problem is, with both the origin of life, the origin of more complex organisms, major transitions, you need very, very complex proteins to allow this to happen. So when you're talking about evolution, what's most important is the complex proteins, which are known to be exceedingly rare.
Am I correct if I translate this into ID proponents and evolutionary biologists on this specific topic are speaking of two different subjects? Are they speaking of different subjects? So they
Yes. Yeah, they're
thus don't connect?
they're focusing on different types of proteins. We're talking about your typical protein. They're talking about rare exceptions to the rule, which happen to be simple. It's a difference between claiming you can train a dog to play Mozart on a piano versus training a dog to catch a stick. They're qualitatively different problems.
But they know that. They know that the important proteins are folded and complex. So it's hard for me to believe there isn't a deliberate attempt to sort of shift to something that looks like it works and pretend that that answers the harder question.
Do you have any idea why this happens?
Why what happens? Why the argument goes that way?
Yeah.
Well, because nobody can go into a lab and show what they would need to show for the origin of life to be plausible in a blind experiment. Nobody can do that. They know they can't do that, so they go to the lab and show something. And then they argue that the something they showed is somehow relevant to the origin of life.
What you have to understand is you have the conversation among experts in the field at your conferences, but then you have people that are trying to sell the public on evolution. So they would be more like public relations experts. They're trying to present a picture of the field that's as attractive as possible. So they'll focus on things like very, very simple proteins, while experts in the field, people like Dan Tofik, would acknowledge, at least at meetings, that they have no idea how an entirely new complex protein came about. Because he described it as, this is a quote, almost like a miracle. So again, there's a big difference between what the public is being told and what experts in the field may know to be true.
This is a very intriguing argument. Are you implying, am I correct if I understand this, saying we have problems of sellers and of evolutionism to the public, while experts don't share the same view, maybe implying that some experts even kind of secretly accept ID, but there's a problem of... Are you saying something like that? Because this is a piece of news for a journalist.
I doubt any of these people accept ID. I mean, we've been at conferences where we can have a conversation that's not being recorded, and some of these experts would say, you've got some very powerful results, but they never concede ID. At least I haven't heard them concede ID. And some of these experts are also the ones who will do some of the selling when they're giving an interview. So the very same people who are doing experiments and know what they're talking about, if they're talking to a journalist or if they're writing to the general population or speaking to the general population, will often inflate the significance of the things that they have demonstrated.
Any more thought on this?
It's important to realize it's not in their own mind they're deliberately lying. It's more that they feel when they present it to the public, they have to simplify, they have to make it accessible. And when they do that, they can exaggerate, might be a good way to put it. So that's the situation. So we're not suggesting that it's a conspiracy or people are just being blatantly deceptive. It's more the bias. It's more that we know evolution's true. So when we present it to the public, we want to make it accessible, so they'll focus on a few positive points that they have and not talk about the challenges that they know they have to face.
It's a problem of oversimplification?
Yes, that's commonly a problem.
And bias.
Yeah.
This is, again, a fascinating argument. Let me a little bit insist on this. Evolutionary biologists maintain that there are smooth paths leading from one protein fold to another. That evolution guides proteins toward more sophisticated structure from the simplest one. am I correct saying, if I say that you don't agree with this, you don't buy this argument, but they, I mean, how can we say that they are wrong if the scientific consensus that we have is pointing in that direction?
Well, if we discuss scientific consensus, we're going to go down another, which we probably should. There's a physical reason that there cannot be a Darwinian path from one folded structure to another folded structure. And the reason is proteins, these beads on a necklace, these pearl necklaces, only fold to a specific structure if they have the right properties in their sequence. And to produce a stable structure means that they are not folding to any other structure. So if I have a folded structure A, and I want to get to a folded structure B, and I want to do that through little changes to the sequence of the gene that encodes the protein, I have to first unfold A and then fold B. And this is not controversial. In other words, a path from A to B, and there is a path, has to undo A and then do B. But that is not a Darwinian path because you get no advantage for undoing A. The only advantage is you can look forward to, if you can design the path, undoing A in order eventually to get B. But a Darwinian path cannot invest in something that will eventually come. It has to have benefit at every step. And so there is no way to do that through a Darwinian path.
It's important to realize that the secular scientific establishment is in many ways a faith community. And what happens is when you're trained to become a scientist in a Western nation, in a nation that's been strongly influenced by materialist philosophy, you're trained to assume everything must have resulted from natural processes. So they assume on faith that there must be a path from simple proteins to complex proteins. That's a faith commitment. But if you talk to experts in the field, again, like Dan Tofik, they're very honest. They'll say the data, the evidence suggests, it points to the fact that different types of proteins, the technical term would be superfamilies or fold classes, are like isolated galaxies. They're extremely different from each other, and there's really not anything in between. They'll also tell you that the experimental evidence shows you that you can alter a protein if you don't alter the structure significantly. So one type of protein essentially stays the same, and you modify it around that particular theme. So they would acknowledge that the data suggests that there are not these paths, or at least if you connected the dots, they give you data that strongly suggests that there's not these paths, but they assume that they must exist. That's the situation.
Dr. Miller, I probably don't get it. Why do you say that you're going from a simple structure to a more complex? It's an act of faith. It's not what you see in nature?
No. What you see in nature, if you look at studies of bacteria, you look at studies of various organisms, you have certain proteins that can mutate and they can modify a little bit. So one protein that, let's say, broke apart one molecule might break apart a different molecule. But you never see a protein with one complex structure turn into something fundamentally different, doing something very, very different. You do not see that.
Dr. X, any comment on this faith argument?
I agree with Brian that, but this is a general characteristic of humans, and therefore a general characteristic of scientists, is that all humans approach an inquiry with some idea of what is real and some idea of what is true. It's impossible not to do that. So I don't fault a Darwinist for approaching biology from a Darwinian lens. But the fact is, if that is a distorting lens, then they are going to approach these questions with false assumptions. And they could rightly say that someone who believes in design approaches biology from a design perspective. And that's true. The difference is, if the vast majority of biologists, since the vast majority of biologists approach their work from a Darwinian perspective, if you're in a small minority, you do not have the luxury of assuming design. You have to speak to the larger group. You have to critique your own idea and show why the other idea is not correct. Whereas if you're in the majority, and a very strong majority, you don't have to pay attention to the minority view.
Thank you. You kind of anticipated my next question, so you already answered that topic. Let me introduce another superstar of this debate, which is natural selection. It's everywhere, and it's used to say that it's sufficient to explain biological complexity, and I need to be very fair and honest, and it seems to be right. I mean, there are arguments supporting the function of natural selection into that. I just want to quote an authority in this field, and I will read so that I will not betray his thought. And this gentleman goes by the name of Mr. Richard Dawkins. And I quote, "Evolution," he says, "is a fact as securely established as any in science, and he who denies it betrays woeful ignorance and lack of education, which likely extends to other fields as well. Evolution is not some recondite backwater of science, ignorance of which would be pardonable. It is the stunningly simple but elegant explanation of our very existence and the existence of every living creature on the planet." End of quote. Dawkins is using very strong words, ignorance and lack of education. And if you, and I'm sure you did, if you read his books, it makes sense why he's using ignorance and lack of education. How can you respond to these are not accusations, it's the result of a logic that he's using, and it seems to be a pretty sound logic. So how do you respond to him?
Want to both take a crack? Or?
You can.
Sure. I'm really happy you brought up that book. His famous book on the topic is The Blind Watchmaker. That might have been where the quote was from. And I remember I became convinced of evolution after reading his book, and due to a lot of the other pressures.
The Blind Watchmaker specifically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he's a master of rhetoric. He's a master storyteller. He's a really brilliant man. The irony, though, is that what he is claiming is irrefutable. Many top-level secular evolutionary biologists believe is wrong. There's actually a meeting at the Royal Society of London where top-level evolutionary theorists like Dennis Noble, Jim Shapiro, Gerd Müller, I can't get his name entirely right, but I apologize for that, came together, and the opening speaker said his model, natural selection, what some call neo-Darwinism, can explain small changes, but it can't explain large changes. And the reason for that is if you look at all of the data we have on pretty much every organism, things like fruit flies, E. coli, cichlid fish, shows that these evolutionary processes are always highly, highly limited. You hit a wall and you do not change. Ironically, natural selection, so-called, always prevents large-scale transformations. So it's just interesting that what he's is calling a irrefutable fact, many top evolutionary biologists know isn't true.
Yes, he's an interesting figure, and I read that book when it first came out, which is probably when Brian was reading it. I was highly skeptical of Darwinism when I read it, and I found it to be not at all convincing, but very well written. And I particularly remember these little, what did he call them? These little graphics.
Oh, yes, yes.
That evolve and take shapes of maybe a dragonfly or something. And he did it on his computer, and he changed little parameters, and they'd move through morphospace. I can't remember what he called them, but a very visually appealing way to argue. But his actual argument fell very short. And I'm not sure, but I bet the quote that you read is not from The Blind Watchmaker. Because one of the things I've noticed in following Dawkins is when he wrote The Selfish Gene, that was his first big book, and The Blind Watchmaker, I think he honestly believed he had a good argument. And then when his argument did not actually persuade people who were skeptical of Darwinism the way he thought it would, I think his approach and his tone changed. So a later book was The God Delusion, where he used strong language like that. You've got to be an idiot not to be a Darwinist. And I think what happened in The Man was he started to become maybe desperate or frustrated that his argument did not actually convince the people who were not already on his team. I describe in my book several key problems with natural selection, and I'm not the first to do that. Way back in the early 20th century, someone coined the phrase, or someone wrote, natural selection may explain the survival of the fittest, but it does not explain the arrival of the fittest. I'll say that again because it's very key. Natural selection may explain the survival of the fittest, but it cannot explain the arrival of the fittest. And what this person was saying is natural selection only operates on variants that are already there. Therefore, it cannot explain how they came to be. And that's a very, very serious problem with natural selection. Did you mention Andreas Wagner? So there are many biologists through the century and a half since Darwin's book, who have recognized that very problem with natural selection.
There's one very important book that a colleague of ours wrote, and he was here last year, is Michael Behe, called Darwin Devolves. Because before the last few decades, we really didn't know exactly what the variation resulted from. But what's happened in the last few decades is people can now sequence genes very, very fast. They can sequence entire genomes of organisms. So Michael Behe did a very extensive study, and what he found was that you find that even mutations which are beneficial degrade information. They damage genes, and they have just an incidental benefit. Or they produce changes that are so trivial that it's essentially could never accumulate to do anything significant. So the more data we have, the more facts that we have, the more that we see that what's called natural selection, or if you want to add in genetic drift and a few other the common mechanisms, is always highly limited according to the data. Even more exciting is work by people like Jim Shapiro, dealing with what's called natural genetic engineering, people that study what's called phenotypic plasticity. And I'll explain that. I apologize to the translators. But what people have found is when you look at organisms, the interesting variation isn't from random mutations all the time. Organisms are designed to monitor the environment, and when the conditions change, they have pre-programmed responses to the changing conditions. Like if a fish, like a cichlid fish, eats a hard food or encounters a predator, the juvenile fish turns into an adult that looks very, very different than if they encountered other conditions. So the really interesting variation is very often pre-programmed responses or mutations that aren't entirely random, because there's mechanisms where organisms can actually cause certain genetic changes much more often than others. Like dogs, there's amazing variation, but a lot of that variation is from a particular genetic change which is targeted by a mechanism, so it happens much more often than other changes. So if you really look at truly random mutations, natural selection, the changes are very, very, very small compared to what the difference is between major different organisms.
You just I lost what you said. You used a very tuned expression,
pre-programmed responses.
Okay, why this is not a product of a natural mechanism?
Oh, it is a natural mechanism, but it's not random. The organism was designed to respond in a certain way. So it responds in the same way over and over and over again in a very limited way. So that can't lead to a large-scale transformation.
Which is a difficulty. For which reason an evolutionary biologist doesn't see that?
They are starting to see it now. Like, remember I told you about the Royal Society meeting?
2016.
2016. I was there.
I was there.
That's right. That's right. We were there. And a couple of the major speakers were people like Jim Shapiro, Dennis Noble, and that was their point. Their point was that the standard evolutionary model really can't explain all that much, but there's these other mechanisms that create very interesting changes. In fact, if you look at that meeting, a lot of other mechanisms were mentioned, like niche construction, but so many of those mechanisms were engineered. They pointed to a mind that engineered organisms to respond to the environment. They don't in any way suggest that random changes can radically transform an organism.
Nor do they suggest that organisms can undergo a change that takes them to something altogether different. A dragonfly cannot become a snake or anything like that. But there do appear to be these inbuilt mechanisms, part of a complex design of life, that allow a living kind to specialize in various ways and to usually eliminate genetic information in order to do this specializing. So it's a one-way trip. You specialize and become something that is well suited to a particular environment, and once you've done that, you can't go back. Michael Behe gives an example of the polar bear in his book, Darwin Devolves. He says, the evidence suggests that the polar bear evolved from the brown bear, but it did so by losing certain genes that adapted it well to the polar environment. But having lost those genes, the polar bear cannot go back and become a brown bear. So the idea is original created forms could have a rich kind of complexity that allows them to radiate in different directions, and when they do, they're then committed to those ways of life.
Quoting Michael Behe, you just used the word creating. Is this going to theological directions or bringing something different in the whole topic? I mean, basically not scientific.
Yes, and Mike Behe probably
God?
didn't use the word creating in his book. But Michael Behe favors intelligent design. He also believes in universal common descent. So Michael Behe believes in the tree of life, but he thinks there was engineered complexity that allowed the tree to unfold. I reject the tree of life. I agree with him that there's inbuilt complexity that allows some unfolding, but I think it's very limited unfolding.
And how would you respond, both of you, to the evolutionary biologists saying that, apart from the quotation or the position of Michael B., your position, you're bringing in something which doesn't belong to science, like, teleology or theology or even religion as such? How would you respond? Because it seems you're moving in another direction, crossing to another field.
If you can define science in different ways, I think the bottom line is you have to have an honest assessment of science once you've agreed on a definition. So there's something called methodological naturalism, which is the idea that scientists should conduct their science and formulate their theories as though naturalism were true. I don't think that's a good way to define science. But if someone does think it's a good way to define science, they need to be honest about whether their theory works. Because if you define science such that God is not a part of it, then it's very possible that you're wrong. And you're going to have a definition of science that doesn't work. So it's the lack of honesty that causes the problem, not necessarily the definition of science.
Now, there's a couple issues. One is when you actually talk about to the public, what do you see? Where does the evidence point? Well, what people have to realize is this idea that science should only talk about natural mechanisms is not what people have always believed. If you go back to the ancient Greeks, there is a debate. When you look at the world, is it purely through natural processes? They called it rules of atoms interacting. Or is there a mind behind it? And there was a pendulum. It swang very strongly towards design for a while. It swang very strongly back towards purely natural processes, like during the Enlightenment. But now it's swinging the other way. Because if you look at younger biologists, they're talking about teleology. And if you talk about at a practical level, what do you do in a laboratory? How do you have results? How do you understand things? More and more engineers are working with biologists. So at a practical level, they're using design-based assumptions, design-based language, and design-based tools, and they're making progress by doing so. Now, philosophically, they may not say, oh, I actually believe in design, but it's that approach that produces good results. In contrast, biologists that assume it's not designed have gone in the wrong direction because of that assumption. They assume it's not designed, so they expect it to be very badly put together, very clumsy, very inefficient, or non-functional. And time again, what they thought was bad design was later proved to be optimal design, beautiful design. So now even secular biologists like Balick from Princeton are saying, if you assume it's optimally designed, ideally designed, that leads to accurate predictions. So here what you're seeing is a design framework is where people are headed at a practical level, even if they don't acknowledge that philosophically.
You used the word assumption many times, and this is, I think, one of the, if I may say, weakest part of intelligent design hypothesis, saying that you need to make an assumption of what you will maybe find at the end before doing it.
No.
Where I am I wrong? And where?
Yeah. To do work from an intelligent design perspective is simply to be open to the real possibility that life is designed. It's not to assume it. So to be open means you can go into the lab and ask a question, get data, interpret the result, and you're not going to force the result to oppose design. It's that the other side is not open, okay? So they have an assumption that there is no God, there can't be design, and therefore they are not open to that as a possibility.
And I give you the mic to you.
What happens is every scientist starts with assumptions. There is no such thing as assumption-free science. If you study cosmology, you study geology, you come to the table with a certain framework, a set of intellectual tools, a way you map data onto your story of how you think happened. So everyone comes with assumptions. The question is, which set of assumptions make accurate predictions, and what story fits the data best? So we believe people's understanding of evolution and biology should be based on evidence, and we believe the framework that best matches reality is the best framework. In contrast, many biologists believe that you start by assuming it's just blind, undirected processes, there's no design logic, and they have no other choice, but that assumption leads to bad predictions consistently. So we believe that our framework allows us the freedom to actually look at the evidence and say, where does the evidence lead? And if the evidence leads to the design, then that's what you should conclude.
In different ways, if I'm not wrong, you're implying that the God hypothesis, to use the part of the title of the conference today, is much more open as a scientific approach. Am I correct? And if I am, can you elaborate a little bit more on that? I mean, it's not the common understanding. People would say, you know, if you put your dogma or your religion at the beginning, which is kind of the same question I put before, but I want to elaborate from a different angle. How can you say that it is a broader approach to science?
I think there's a caricature of intelligent design that says that because you think design is real, you're not interested in asking hard questions or in gathering data. And that's not true. Because I believe that design is real, I'll speak for myself, and everyone can have their own view. Because I believe that design is real, I am very open to an interpretation that acknowledges design. I don't force my result to acknowledge design. And sometimes I've had results that could easily fit with a Darwinian interpretation, and I didn't change the results. I published them anyway. But I'm open to a design interpretation. Now, if you're on the other side of this, I think most scientists in the life sciences, anyway, are not even open to it. They're not even willing to acknowledge that the materialist, naturalist paradigm doesn't work or doesn't do a good job of explaining certain things. They're not interested in asking the question, and therefore they're only going to go in one direction. And they're going to have a hard time acknowledging when the science refuses to go with them in that direction.
Dr. Miller?
Yeah, and I think I come at it from a slightly different perspective because I studied engineering. So
did I.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. As opposed to like your typical biologist. So we will come to the table with a different set of tools. And what happens is we have, like if you want to fix a car and all you're given is like a screwdriver, you're going to do some things helpful, but you're not going to do as well if you don't have the wrench and the other tools. In the same way, Doug is trained as a biologist and as an engineer. I'm trained in physics and engineering. So we can come to the table and understand life using all of those tools. And we can make the case that that helps you to understand life at a much deeper, more full level than just assuming it's an accident of nature.
Let me be very clear to the audience and our host tonight, En Arche Foundation. I'm not interested in religion as such, but they brought me to this argument, introducing the God hypothesis as a scientific approach. This is very intriguing, I think, and this is why I asked them some question I was not thinking of before listening to them. And this is quite interesting, I think, and it's one of the core questions between ID proponents and evolutionary biologists. Again, not because ID proponents are smuggling in God, but and this is their words, but because God is a scientific hypothesis too. I think we need to convince many people of this. So if you have any other comment on this, it will be most welcome. I don't want to force you to add more on that, but keeping it on the scientific level, because we are not trained. I mean, it's a kind of surprise to me, listening to you and carrying the topic at that level.
I have an analogy that might be helpful. Let's imagine a spaceship crashed in Cracow. There's a spaceship there, and your government surrounds it, puts on the tape you use, and they think, we have to understand what's going on here. So they bring in 2 teams of specialists. One team assumes a spaceship had to have been produced by natural processes. Another assumes it could be designed. Well, who's going to make progress? If you assume the spaceship was just produced by natural processes, you have to imagine maybe volcanoes produced molten metal. The metal fell into crevices that looked like spaceship parts, and then tornadoes and hurricanes brought all the parts together and assembled a spaceship. Now, that's not going to work very well. You're going to make no progress. In contrast, if you come at it as an engineer, you'll say this spaceship probably follows principles that we see in engineering. There's probably propulsion systems, navigation systems, feedback loops, control systems. Well, you're going to make an enormous amount of progress from that framework. In the same way, with Origin of Life, it's a complete failure. They've made no progress in the last 75 years because they're coming at it from the wrong perspective. In contrast, when engineers look at life, what do they see? They see design logic that's very similar to the design logic we use. There's a beautiful paper by Hershock and Reeves that talk about how the cell looks like an embedded computing system. And what they do is they look at a human computing system, and they look at the parts, the functions. They then match it up with the cell, and it fits beautifully. That the same logic you see here is what you see in life. So I see biology as reverse engineering a technology far superior to our own. And I argue that that framework leads to robust results, deep understanding. But if you assume that life is just an accident, like many biologists do, then all the assumptions they have about life lead them in the wrong direction. They assume there is no higher organization. There can't be, because there's no mind. They assume it'll probably be fairly badly designed, inefficient. None of that's true. So I would say that this framework is far superior. Now, if you look at the bigger picture, that fits beautifully if you're a Christian. And sure, it might fit if you believe in the Gaia hypothesis, or a Muslim, or an Orthodox Jew, or perhaps even a Buddhist. But the extent to which that fits other worldviews is a really important question. But the bottom line is, assuming design gets results because that's the better framework.
Can I just add, going back to this God of the gaps critique, what Brian is saying here is not that the design hypothesis gets results because we stop the science. It's the opposite. It gets results because it inspires you to ask the right questions, questions that you're willing to ask that other people maybe are not willing to ask. So it's really the opposite. By assuming that there is no God and that everything has been produced by natural processes, you can prevent yourself from seeing important things that are true about life. You can actually stop doing science that you should be doing. And there's a key distinction because, in the propaganda battle over this, the other side wants to say that once you open the door to God existing, you're cutting off science, and it couldn't be further from the truth.
This is quite revolutionary. I mean, it's not the common approach of
It is.
mainstream, if I may use this, rather obscure term, mainstream approach to science. Are you strongly convinced of that?
Yes, and if you go back in history, science has not always had this yoke of naturalism attached to it. Modern science was born out of Christian worldview, where scientists expected there to be intelligible order in nature because of the God who created nature. It's only relatively recently that there's been sort of an allergic reaction to that, an overreaction to that, and a rule put in place that one cannot countenance God when doing science.
What's really fascinating is people often fail to distinguish biology from the other sciences. Because the materialist approach, just assuming natural laws, works beautifully in physics. Like physics, you can explain with simple equations. Well, simple if you have a PhD in physics. Chemistry, same thing. Simple equations, natural processes. Geology, very nice. Biology is different. Biology is completely different. And it's interesting to note that the whole idea of design in biology goes back to Aristotle, because Aristotle focused on biology. He studied biology very carefully, and he's the one that talked one of the ones who talked most clearly about teleology in the world, and that's no accident. So what happens is people sort of believe, because this materialistic view of the world was so successful with chemistry and physics, it should be as successful with biology, and it's not. Because what you find is, I call it a materialism of the gaps. Because every time biologists try to explain some complex biological structure through an evolutionary process, they go through some narrative, but evolutionary narratives consistently collapse when you look at the details of the biology. And mathematics. Mathematics is like a universal acid that dissolves away evolutionary narratives. Because when you look at how long it takes for new information to arise from an undirected process, it's far, far, far longer than the time that's ever available. So you might think an evolutionary narrative might make sense now, but that's just because we don't understand the biology. The more you understand the biology, the more likely the narrative will collapse. Also, you constantly see biologists say, we don't understand this, therefore it's bad design, which leads them not to study it carefully. In contrast, as the science advances, and particularly as engineers get involved, they see that it's actually optimally designed and not badly designed. So again, I would say the materialist framework has been incredibly problematic with biology.
I thank you for your answers, and they're beautifully crafted, and they make a lot of sense in the way you put it. But I don't want to go astray. We mentioned in passing scientific consensus, whatever we intend with that. Maybe there are different expressions. And again, I don't want to touch too much different topic, but what you're describing, again, it's beautifully crafted. It makes sense in the way you do it. You say that science was born out of Christianity, that for most of our history, at least in the West, there was no materialistic approach to science. But if you look at public TV, private TV, academic courses, so you go up, you just have a different approach, and this different approach leads the way, leads our world. I'm not putting words you don't use in your mouth, but someone could say, coming from outside in this room, saying you're describing kind of a conspiracy against new ID proponents. So you're the victims, you're the good guys, and all the others, the majority of the world democratic world we live in, just hold the opposite view. How could that be?
So this takes us to a discussion of consensus and the role of consensus in science, which I think is an important topic to think about. I think historically, science has worked best when there isn't an enforcement of one view of what has been confirmed. In other words, science works best when people with different ideas about how things work are allowed to work on those ideas and present those ideas. And not all of those ideas will win the day. Not all of those ideas are good. So the idea is, in a healthy market of ideas, good ideas tend to be more persuasive, and ideas that don't work tend to be less persuasive. Some people would say that is how science is being carried out today. It's not. What's happening today, you hear during the COVID era of the science says this. Very quickly, there's a tendency for sort of a political consensus to emerge within a scientific community. And then, once that emerges, it uses power to shut down anything that questions it. That tends to be the way science works on anything that has worldview implications. It's not a freedom to have all ideas on the table and let them compete. It is rather sort of an authority structure that prefers not to have certain ideas on the table and then prevents them from being pursued.
You ask really beautiful questions. First of all, it's important to realize science only advances when a small minority challenges the consensus. One of my favorite examples is Alfred Wegener. He was the person who first observed that continents moved because he noticed that Africa and South America looks like they used to fit together really nicely. He noticed that the geological columns were very similar. He was not a geologist. I believe he was a meteorologist. And he was vilified by the establishment. People were told that if you're a grad student and you show any sympathy to Wegener, you could lose your career. So it was him, just him, for decades. He died before people really accepted his ideas. But eventually what happened is the data changed. People looked at seafloors and they noticed seafloor spreading. They noticed magnetic fields that were shifting. And he was proven right, despite the fact it was him against the entire world. Well, I would argue that you see a very similar pattern, because it's not just that the establishment has their ideas. This debate about design goes back for 2,500 years, back to 500 BC, and the pendulum swings very, very slowly. But what you're seeing is this sort of handful of radical scientists saying, let's consider design, have published papers in top journals. Our books have gotten endorsements by Nobel laureates. In fact, a wonderful example is Marcus Eberlin. He wrote a book called Foresight, which was a very overtly design-based book, and 3 Nobel laureates endorsed it. We have people that have published articles in places like the Journal of Theoretical Physics, the Journal of Theoretical Biology, and it's like one of the most downloaded journals you can find. Plus, what you're seeing is that right now, data is coming online that was not available. It was just like with plate tectonics. So Michael Behe could only write his book, Darwin Devolves, because the data had been available only for a fairly short amount of time. We see a revolution taking place in biology, like systems biology, where engineers are working with biologists, and they are saying that a radical shift is taking place, that people are breaking free from philosophical assumptions and seeing the world in a new way. So this is a very exciting time, and from the lessons of history, we're on the right course.
Can I ask Brian I want to know what you think about this. If you mentioned plate tectonics.
Yes.
So there's all kinds of theories. Einstein comes along and disrupts classical mechanics with relativity. Plate tectonics disrupts the prior geological model. Many of those cases of disruption don't involve a worldview challenge. Yes. So you don't have to bring God into the question of whether there's plate tectonics or not. Do you think that when there is a worldview connection, as there is in biological origins or the origin of the universe, that those dynamics become even more sort of ossified, or the resistance is even more intense?
I think you're absolutely right, because who cares if continents move or don't move?
But they did just because this is our theory. Go away, you newcomer.
Right. But the average person, working in wherever they're working, really wouldn't care that much.
Right.
Like your average person who's a mother or a father who's working, making a living, if continents moved or don't move, that doesn't matter. But if it is the case that life is not an accident, but is designed, that has enormous philosophical implications. Right. It changes everything, how we understand politics, economics, everything. So yes, I think you're absolutely right that the fact that the philosophical implications are so profound is going to make it much more difficult. And interestingly enough, when you look at Darwin's theory, the people that championed it, the people that were promoting it, were really honest about the fact that there were certain philosophical implications of the theory that they really liked. People like Aldous Huxley, who was very open, he said, and he was the grandson of Thomas Huxley, and Thomas Huxley was one of the most vocal proponents of Darwin's theories. Aldous Huxley said, look, this idea that we're an accident of nature, we have no meaning or purpose, he thought was a liberation tool that he loved. So yes, you're absolutely right.
You see how brilliant guests we have today. They can take my job, but I cannot take theirs. Are you implying that it is the philosophical implication, as you were suggesting, that makes Darwinism on one side and intelligent design on the other side so controversial? So it's not really the scientific thing, but it's the implication and the consequences. Evolutionary biologists wouldn't buy that argument. It's their fault, isn't it? Or
well, it's interesting because if you read carefully, I'm thinking of our friend Richard Dawkins, who sponsored an ad on the red double-decker buses in London. And I'll try to get the wording exactly right. The big posters on the buses said, "There's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life." Okay, so there's philosophy in there. And when I first read that, I thought, what is he even thinking? I think what he's thinking connects to what Thomas Huxley was thinking. And that is, I have a way that I want to live my life, and if God is there, that's profoundly inconvenient. So I don't want God to be there. This is Richard Dawkins, who would claim that he's a scientist who only accepts Darwinism for its scientific merit. But in that bus ad, he reveals there's something else going on in Richard Dawkins. And I think that's very common.
And it is very common when you press people and you talk with them, they'll say, we can't consider non-material processes. So they recognize that this isn't some objective discussion where we're looking at evidence and data. They say we are absolutely committed to only consider natural processes. We will not consider design. If you corner them, they can be very honest about that. So it is absolutely the case, even consciously by many people, that it is this philosophical commitment that is preceding the evidence. It's what supersedes the evidence that many would acknowledge if they're honest.
Mm-hmm.
Tonight we mentioned names and use quotations and title of books, and of course it's clear to everyone that we have no ad hominem argument. We're not being, unpolite to anyone. We're just using these people because they do public statements in books and elsewhere, and we use them as emblems and symbols and representatives of some position in science and beyond science that we want to discuss from different perspectives. I think this is very clear, but I'm a journalist, and I know how journalists can make no argument out of nothing. So, it is very important to be clear on that also. You mentioned before engineering, and you said in different ways you have training in engineering, and you use the engineering language, so from one specific science into biology and other things, and it's quite natural for you to do that, probably because, as you underlined, because of your training in that field also. Do evolutionary biologists find no problem in putting the engineering metaphor into their speech? You realize I have always the same questions, but I want to be convinced, and I'm taking the question from different angles, trying to get a hold of what ID really is, and try to convince myself through your help if ID is something feasible or not. So engineering, it's natural for you to use that metaphor or language and to draw comparison. Is it normally accepted by evolutionary biology? And if not, why?
I think it depends on what you're reading, but if you read an article that explains how the bacterial flagellum works, for example, or how a rod cell or a cone cell work in the retina, you'll read something that looks a lot like engineering in that they're laying out a complex function. There's terminology, there's diagrams that show how this complex function is being carried out. And there's really no other way to do it when you're talking about literally a rotary motor that turns at 100,000 RPM, is driven by proton flow through the little motor, and is driving, in the case of the bacterial flagellum, is driving a propeller that allows the bacteria to swim. So any clear description of that is at some level going to look like engineering. But what's not allowed is to say that it really is engineering. So I think Richard Dawkins would say it gives the appearance of design. It looks like someone engineered it, but don't take that too seriously because no one actually did. It's interesting in the case of Brian and me, we came to biology having some training in engineering. And maybe that's helpful sometimes, because when we look at those things, I remember I was an early graduate student being told about a genetic regulatory, a feedback loop that does genetic regulation, turns a gene on, turns a gene off in a very elegant way. And I was trained as an engineer, and I thought, that is engineering. That's molecular level engineering. So it may not be a coincidence that people who come to biology from engineering are more open to this way of viewing the discipline.
Yeah, and it's important to realize in the academy, people are very, very specialized. Really, they have this very small topic they look at. Like maybe a biologist looks at one neurotransmitter in the brain, or one chemical reaction, or one pathway. And there's different subdisciplines. So many biologists who study, let's say, some metabolic reaction are not trained to think like engineers. They focus on what's called a reductionist approach. That means all the magic happens at the lowest level of organization, the simple reactions. So you want to understand this reaction, that protein, and then they'll come together and you'll see, let's say, a higher level structure. Very bottom, low level, simple reactions, to the top level, which is a high level organization. Engineers think in exactly the opposite way. They think, what is the purpose? What are the goals? What does that mean about the high level engineering? I want to design a car. I know I need a passenger section. I need a transmission system. I need an engine. That's the high level organization. Then you think, well, what does the engine need? Well, the engine needs the part where it burns the gas. The engine needs to convert it to mechanical energy. Okay, fine. Well, what does that part look like? Then you get to the little nitty-gritty details, the little details. So what happens is some biologists, like in systems biology, think more like engineers. They're better at the higher level analysis. There's a beautiful book put out by MIT, which is systems modeling of cellular systems. It's filled with engineering language. But it's not everybody. It's sort of patchwork. What's really interesting, though, is how much all biologists can be helped by learning to think like engineers. Like one of our colleagues is a wonderful biologist named Emily Reeves, and she's very open about her views. She writes for our articles. She came to the table thinking like a biologist, but then she started to work with our engineers. And what happened is the way she presented materials radically changed. So instead of saying, well, this is how photosynthesis works. You've got this reaction, this reaction, this reaction, this reaction, and you get some of this. She's like, well, from an engineering perspective, here are the goals. Here are the constraints. Here is where you have to give and take. And when she talked about it from that perspective, it produced far more insights because she learned to think top-down, higher purposes. She learned to think in terms of goals, and it made her analysis much more robust, much more clarifying, and much more rich. So what you're seeing now is a revolution as we speak, that more and more engineers are entering the field, so different patchworks of the field, different subdisciplines are moving in this direction. So in many ways, we're not inventing this from scratch. There's a wave taking place that's getting bigger and bigger, and we want to be on top of that wave because we believe in design. We can do it even better. We can bring more insights that other people might miss because of their philosophical blinders. That's kind of where we are.
That's the key distinction is top-down thinking versus bottom-up thinking. Biologists are trained to think bottom-up. Engineers are trained to think top-down. That's very key.
And this could be a key to understanding the dichotomy between ID and evolutionary approach, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Let me give you another quotation, and I read again for not losing any element by, again, Richard Dawkins. And it's very well crafted, so we are using it for this reason. And he says, biology is the study of complicated things that have the appearance of having been designed with a purpose. End of quote. This gets me to two different questions. Would you define simply the ID hypothesis, the ID approach as reality has a purpose? Would you define simply ID that or more than that?
This is really interesting because Richard Dawkins is extremely perceptive. So he makes comments that clarify issues in ways that even many biologists haven't clarified for themselves. Like there's a famous quote that teleology or purpose is like a mistress. Biologists don't want to be seen with her in public, but they can't live without her. So in many ways, biologists are a bit schizophrenic. That on one hand, they kind of know there is purpose. On one hand, they have to think in those terms. On the other hand, they know they can't. So it's kind of this, it can be kind of messy of what's going on up here. But from a design perspective, we believe that purpose is real, that there is design behind it. And we believe that that recognition, that insight, is going to lead to better research, better predictions, a more robust research program. That's the fundamental difference. Evolution is interesting because you have, what does evolution really predict? And then what do evolutionists claim it predicts? So if you go back to the time of Darwin, evolutionists would say, we predict an unfolding tree of life, gradual changes. We predict that if you look at similarities, they'll point to a very consistent tree. We predict that changes will be gradual, random, and undirected. Well, everything they predicted turned out to be wrong. The fossil record doesn't show a tree changing. It shows things appear suddenly and doesn't change. The comparison of similarities in organisms doesn't suggest a consistent tree. It's an absolute mess. The appearance of change often appears to be engineered to happen very rapidly and very consistently. But what happens is evolutionists will say, well, what we predicted isn't true, so now we'll predict what we see. We'll call it punctuated equilibrium. We'll talk about horizontal gene transfer. We'll throw a few different pieces in here and make sure that now we predict what we actually see. That's if that makes sense. But what's important to realize is there are some very clear predictions that have always been made. One is that biology should be suboptimal a lot of the time. But two, biology should not look a whole lot like human engineering. But what's clearly the case is the opposite is true. You look at biology, you see what looks like top-down design, how an engineer planned everything in advance. You see how biology uses the same patterns we use, the same concerns, the same strategies. So a systems engineer cares about things like interfaces, like how does one system interface with another. They care about things like error correction, risk management. What do you see in life? Like our hearing system is really amazing. We've got 3 bones that create like a double hinge. You have specialized muscles that attach to those bones, so there's a feedback loop. If the noise is too loud, a feedback loop causes a muscle to stop the bone from vibrating to protect your ears. That's an engineering strategy. You've got this beautiful interface where sound through air faces a different resistance than sound through a liquid. So our hearing system has air hits the tympanic membrane, and then the lever arm sends it to what's called the cochlea, which is a tube filled with fluid. So the sound goes through the fluid. Well, if the air sound went right to the fluid, it would all bounce off because the resistance isn't matched. So there's a genius engineering solution that matches the resistance so all the energy goes through. You can actually perceive the mind of the creator if you're a systems engineer. Inside the cochlea, you have this channel that gets more and more narrow, so it vibrates in different places with different frequency, so that the hair cells will send the signal from different frequencies independently. So you've got signal processing. So what you're finding in life is you're seeing exactly the same logic we use. You're seeing the same principles, the same patterns. So systems engineers see exactly what you'd expect from the product of a mind and exactly what you would not expect if it was a blind, undirected process.
Well put, yeah. So if we go back to this Dawkins' use of purpose, living things have the appearance of being designed for a purpose. That's like purpose to Dawkins is a mirage. You think you see water on the horizon, but as you get close, the water disappears. It's not really water. So the key distinction is purpose a mirage that should disappear as we approach it, or is it at the very foundation of life? And I think you're right. The key distinction between the Dawkins view and our view is we say it's fundamental. And the more you know, the more it looks like purpose, not the less. Whereas Dawkins would say the deeper you dig, the purpose evaporates.
So being a journalist, a good title would be The Blind Watchmaker versus Purpose in Reality, not only life, but reality. Would be that correct?
Sure.
I had a title. I once wrote an article. I said,
I told you they can do my job, but not...
the blind watchmaker regains his sight.
Good.
Thank you. I'm going to pay you copyrights for using that. And the second question that prompted me, that the quotation by Dawkins prompted me to, is that you anticipated much of this question during your presentation or answers, but let me just underline it one more time. Does identifying design in biological system has any scientific merit?
Does it have scientific merit? Or the idea of...
To devise design. Does that add more knowledge?
Oh.
Add more to our knowledge of reality? You anticipated a little bit this.
Yes, for sure. In multiple ways. I mean,
I want you to strengthen and to kind of repeat also, but since this is very much controversial.
I think if you're open...
I'm sorry, but many people would say, that perspective is not very much adding to real knowledge of things. Maybe they're ignoring facts. Maybe they don't understand your argument.
Well, I think Brian has given some example. A key example that you didn't give is the junk DNA hypothesis. So when the human genome was sequenced, we find that a very small fraction of the genome appears to be genes that encode protein sequences. And a large fraction appears not to be that. Well, if you think that design is only a mirage, and you think that our genomes were cobbled together by chance, you might think that the part that's not coding is just junk. And that's what they said. They said, this is junk DNA. But as the science moves on, we find out that there's a whole lot of processing of RNA occurring in what was called the junk DNA. So much so that nobody uses that term anymore. Nobody believes in junk DNA. A design view that takes purpose to be at the center of life never would have predicted that most of our genomes would be junk. And that prediction, the negation of that has turned out to be correct. Our whole genome appears to be highly active and doing very sophisticated computations using RNA, not just the coding part.
People that say that a design framework doesn't add to our knowledge of biology demonstrate that their understanding of the technical literature is 15 to 20 years out of date, because the design framework is the only framework that will give us understanding of the higher level design logic of life because evolution predicts there is no high-level design logic for life. So there's many, many, many papers published where engineers have shown that their design framework leads to understanding of biology. Great example, control feedback loops, control systems. There are research articles talking about how the same principles that we use are being applied in biology. We have one of our colleagues is a man named Stuart Burgess. He's in the United Kingdom, and he has written multiple articles showing how you can take the design principles of like dragonfly wings to make better micro-air vehicles. If you've seen the movie Dune, you see kind of what we're talking about. He's looked at the knee, which people said, oh, well, I think that looks badly designed. Well, that's because they weren't engineers. And he's shown that you can take the design logic of the knee and create prosthetic limbs, create robot limbs, which are optimally designed because they were optimally designed in us. So there's many, many examples where it's already been proven that an engineering or design framework is what brings fruitful understanding to biology, and how studying biology helps us to do better engineering.
We have a few minutes left before opening the mics to questions from the public. You defended your position of ID proponents pretty well, I think. They will judge, and with a very good rhetoric and a very good fitting examples. My last question, and I open the mic to you before opening the mic to the audience. Having said that, and we are all convinced that you are ID proponents, do you see any problem in the ID hypothesis, or do you see any dark angles that we need to explore? Your answer could be, of course, yes or no, or you can articulate on that. And so you could even point at some more research in that direction that need to clarify things that are not clear enough now, being proponents of ID, of course. Right. But, you know, do you see some limits even of that theory?
In a sense, the fact that the work of understanding biology from a design perspective has only barely begun, we're at, the first step, is a good thing for science. So if the question is there a lot of work that remains to be done to have a complete understanding of life from a design perspective, I would say yes, a whole lot of work. But I'd also say that's a good thing, because that means we need a lot of people to do this. If I interpret your question as, are there challenges that come with being a design advocate? Then the answer is yes. The opposition is the biggest challenge, not the idea. So the fact that we are trying to advance an idea that is so systematically opposed is a challenge for doing work from this perspective.
So there is nothing unconvincing in the idea hypothesis for you?
No.
One of the most this is an issue that we really face because I'm working with biologists and engineers. An engineering perspective is very, very fruitful in many ways, but it may be the case that there's aspects of life that cannot be understood through engineering. Like, for instance, is our mind purely physical? Is it just, is our physical brain all there is? Is there something that transcends it? So life is very similar to engineering in many ways, but life is also very, very different from human engineering. Part of the differences is because it was produced by a mind superior to our own, but some of the differences might be because there's something that's so fundamentally different about life that an engineering perspective will never help us understand it. That's possible. That line is a very complex question that is something we have to wrestle with. Another interesting question is the issue, not necessarily from a design perspective, but even if you want to broach other topics like theology and philosophy. how do we understand all of the design that might offend our sensibilities, like nature red in tooth and claw, or these interesting parasites? So that's a fascinating question that is beyond the design framework, but those are questions that need to be addressed in the fields of philosophy and theology.
Let's give them a big round of applause to thank them. Dr. Douglas X, Dr. Brian Miller. Thank you so much for being very honest. I had no doubt, but you're honest in your approach and just not hiding behind obscure metaphors or obscure thoughts, confusing the mind of people who needs answer. So thank you very much for your expertise, your simplicity also in presenting things. And it's time now to open the microphone for possible questions from the audience. I'm not sure how much time do we have, so I'm asking to the organizer how much. Okay, we almost have half an hour for Q&A session, so don't be shy and get to the microphone. I, of course, ask you to keep it short, the question I mean, yes, and right to the topic, and a question, real question, not a counter-argument, as we Italians always do.
Good evening. I'm delighted to be here. I've heard a lot of critique about evolutionism. And what is your answer to the question on how did life emerge scientifically? Thank you.
Origin of life.
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is where you have to go beyond the science into more philosophy, into theology. And let me use an analogy. If you've seen the movie Contact with Jodie Foster, a beautiful movie. In this movie, what happened is Jodie Foster is part of SETI, which is the search for extraterrestrial life. And they receive this signal from space, and the signal has prime numbers, which suggests it's designed, but then it has the schematic of a spaceship, and they build the spaceship, and that's part of the movie. So the question becomes, does that signal look designed? And the answer is absolutely it looks designed. The question could become, what produced the signal? Well, if you believe it's designed, then you have to recognize that the designer has an intelligence greater than ourselves, so we may not know all of the details of how that signal was produced. If you look at life, even the simplest possible cell, for various reasons I'll talk about tomorrow, could not have emerged through natural processes, and it shows evidence of a technology far superior to ourselves. But because it was produced by a mind greater than ourselves, we don't know how it got here. I am a Christian, so I believe God acted in the world to produce a cell. If I went back in time, I don't know what that would look like. If Richard Dawkins was here, he would say, well, maybe it was designed, but I believe it was aliens that brought the cell here, but he couldn't tell you exactly what the spaceship looked like. So the answer is, I don't know exactly what that looks like. That's where the science ends. The science says it looks designed. My faith comes in, and I can go beyond the science and say, I kind of believe God did it. That's kind of me.
Well, but the science doesn't end with saying it looks designed. You can do a lot of science to say, here are the elements that make it work. But I agree. There are some questions, whatever your viewpoint is, there are some questions of origins where it's very hard to get to something that looks like a video of what happened.
I am a professor at the University of Warsaw, and I am a linguist by education, by profession. So I have a question from my perspective. You said things about the origins, you said something about evolution, but we didn't hear an answer to the question about what life is. From your perspective, from your point of view, do you think bacteria can be described as living organisms? Or, as Aquinas said, do bacteria have life?
Yes. So I would say bacteria definitely do have life. It's interesting to have a linguist ask a question like this because I think language is something at the essence of life. In my book and in a course I teach at biology, at Biola on biology, I say that this is the big question in biology that has not been answered, and that is, what is life? Because I think a Darwinian view of life gives you a very impoverished view of what life is. A Darwinist would say life is self-replicators that evolve and become different self-replicators, which I think is very impoverished. Life is something much deeper than that, but I have a feeling that we're not close to a fully satisfactory answer to that.
Yeah, there's several people that have had some deep insights. I agree, we don't fully understand it, but there's some very deep insights. Like Scott Turner is a biologist, and he talks about how life demonstrates what's called homeostasis. So most physical processes will try to take you to equilibrium. Ice melts on a hot day, something will decompose. But life holds itself in a state which is far from equilibrium, and it has to keep using energy to maintain itself. So for a mouse to stay a mouse, it has to keep eating food, and there has to be lots of machinery to keep it as a mouse to repair damage. And what happens with life is life maintains homeostasis by monitoring the environment, both external and internal, and acting in a way to maintain homeostasis. That's a wonderful perspective of what's different about life. Another mathematician is named Robert Rosen. He said that life demonstrates causal closure. So for instance, if you have a car, something else had to build the car. The factory had to build the car. You had to drive the car. Well, that may not be the case in 10 years. But life creates itself and drives itself. So it has causal closure in that it controls everything about itself. So I would say homeostasis and causal closure are two very important aspects of what makes life.
Good evening. Professor asks, you said that a monkey randomly hitting keys on a typewriter would not write a Shakespearean poem. However, if the monkey had unlimited time and an infinite number of attempts, at some point it could produce 152 pages of characters that would match the content of Macbeth. One edition of the poem has 152 pages. This probability is very small, but theoretically possible. This line of thinking provides a solid basis for claiming that we might be here by chance and the watchmaker is blind. I'd very much like my thesis to be refuted so that I can demonstrate the rationality of faith to those who are unconvinced. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think among many people, the long age of the universe at 15 billion years and the long age of Earth at roughly 5 billion years seems to be an answer to improbability. So if something is very improbable, if you give it enough time, eventually it becomes probable. But when you analyze this with math, which you have to, the improbabilities that we're talking about are way beyond what all the planets in the visible universe over 15 billion years could give you. So the 150 pages of text from a monkey, the odds against that are so incredibly extreme that billions of years are of no account whatsoever. And it's not hard to show that. So to answer people who think that billions of years is enough time to do this, you can do some very simple calculations that show that that's not true. I referred to there having been, in the billions of years of history of life, 10 to the 40th cells. So that means if living things are going to stumble upon something remarkable, they need to find it in 10 to the 40th attempts or fewer. When I look at the odds, at the improbability of getting a single folded protein, it's way beyond that, way beyond that. And there isn't really much you can do in life with a single protein. The complex systems of life involve dozens or hundreds of proteins. So it's way, way beyond that. So in other words, I'm sympathetic that people think billions of years is long enough to do something special. But when you look at the probabilities, it really is not the answer.
Just to put some numbers, Bill Dembski is a colleague of ours, and he calculated, based on the age of the universe, the number of particles in the universe, and the fastest action that can take place, that if anything is less probable than 1 divided by a 1 with 150 zeros, it can't happen. Well, if you look at research by people like Tompa and Rose, the probability of a cell existing is more like 1 divided by 1 with 1 billion zeros. So there's just no comparison.
Thank you very much. What is the nature of intelligent design? Is it something that is inscribed within an object, or is it about somebody intervening in an object?
Oh, that's a great question.
Huh. I'll give an answer and you can give an answer. I think both aspects are there. So intelligent design requires an intelligence. So we believe that intelligence is God. So it requires God to have done something. One of the things I teach my students in a course that I teach is if a creator, whenever a creator creates something,
so would you say that intelligent design requires the existence of God?
No. This was intelligently designed. I mean, it requires God in that there wouldn't be humans apart from God, but there can be intelligent design where the intelligence is not God. And that's common for all human technology. Humans are the intelligent designers. We wouldn't exist apart from God. So in the end, nothing is going to exist apart from God. But one of the things that I impress upon my students is whenever a creator creates, he or she leaves something of himself or herself in the created thing. So it's not just the case that living things show evidence of having been designed, they also reveal something of the designer. So in that sense, there's an impression, not just that it's complex and requires a designer, it shows something of the mind of the designer.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note that in terms of life, you can't distinguish a priori if life is designed by God, by an alien, by time travelers. So you see evidence of design, but the science only tells you that. You can't get from that to who the designer is. But speaking as a Christian, and I helped Stephen Meyer write the book Return of the God Hypothesis, what you see is design in life. That's design in the world. But also you see design behind the laws of nature. So you have a designer that designed our universe, but also designed entities within our universe. So you put those both together, and that kind of narrows the playing field of what that designer could be.
I would add to that we are designers, humans are designers, but the only thing we create really is our own thoughts. And then we've been given by God the ability to think actions that allow us to manipulate the physical world. We cannot create thinkers. We cannot create minds. And AI does not prove otherwise. We cannot create minds. So if you establish that a human being has an immaterial mind, you are establishing that even an alien could not have made us, because we're not just material things, and we have no way to make something like us.
Good evening. I have a more practical question, more practical rather than philosophical, even though I know that philosophy is of interest for many. The example of a spaceship crashing was a great one for me. And there were those two approaches, and you gentlemen talked about the combination of biology, engineering, and how all of us may benefit from reversed assumptions. That is, from assuming that intelligent design is there. My son studies biology, well, actually, biomedical engineering. What could I advise him so as his work in the future benefits many? Well, in the context of intelligent design, any pieces of advice that I could give to my son?
Well, yeah. Oh, that is such a wonderful question. I would encourage your son to look at people that are leaders in the field. Like Stuart Burgess is a great professor. He has lots of research articles. And definitely to, like, when you study, you have your set curriculum, but then ask yourself, what would be good to study beyond that, to always be learning? Because it really, things are changing so fast. So I would encourage him to go beyond what he knows and keep learning more biology, learn embryology, learn molecular biology. So just keep learning as much as he can, and then think about very carefully what field he wants to go into. So obviously he should be great at computer programming, electronics, and if he really wants to know the cutting edge, he may not be able to study this, but quantum applications in biology are an incredibly cutting-edge field of biology. So we're not doing it now, but in 40 years, I bet we will be. So if you look at things about how like birds exploit quantum principles for detecting polarized light, I think that would be an amazing thing to look into.
There will be a natural connection to engineering and biomedical engineering. Some of the really exciting things occurring now, is it called neural lace? Elon Musk's interface with the brain. So, and many of you have seen video of a quadriplegic who is controlling his computer, not by moving his eyes and something following his eye motion, but by something being attached to his brain, to the motor cortex, and he thinks and the cursor responds. So it's an amazing advance in technology that allows someone who has been crippled to use his mind in a new way. But it's also interesting how meager that is in comparison to God's original design. It's a wonderful blessing for someone to be able to recover something like this, but it also reminds you how remarkable the design of the brain is in the first place that allows us to do all the things that we do.
I would also encourage him to study ethics and transhumanism, because a lot of this technology can go in very unhealthy directions. So that's something he has to always think about.
Right.
I'm a biologist by education. I'm interested in intelligent design more as an observer, because for the time being, I'm a proponent of the theory of evolution. But I've been following this debate around intelligent design. I am assuming that it might be true. I agree with some of your comments on the theory of evolution, because the theory of evolution comes with many shortcomings and leaves a lot of question marks. As regards the origin of life, I can only talk about hypotheses with no hard evidence. I understand that from the point of view of intelligent design, we undermined or we challenged the biological processes behind origin of life, and instead you propose intelligent design as an explanation. The question is, who is the creator? Someone asked whether it has to be God, because if we believe that is not down to nature itself, we tend to think of God. But if not God, what else? What else might put intelligent design to life? I often defend the theory of intelligent design during different debates and discussions, because people claim that intelligent design is creationism disguised. I usually tell them that it's so much more. But if not God, then who else? That is my question. I suppose, and I would be interested in your opinion, would you say that it's possible that for life to exist on Earth, the theory of panspermia might offer an explanation that life arrived from space? But then again, the question is, what is the origin of life out there in the space? So who is behind the intelligent design? That is basically the question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you ask a very thoughtful question, and you're right. It could be, panspermia is the idea that life came from someplace else, some other planet. And even people like Francis Crick, who was the co-discoverer of DNA, I believe, believed in directed panspermia. He believed literal aliens brought life to us. And from the scientific evidence, that could be the case. Now, I would argue, though, that the problems for life originating on Earth would be the same any place else in our universe, because life by its very nature would almost certainly require very complex molecules that carry information. You will probably have to deal with information processing, energy production, and I would say that would point to design in any context, even if it was life that was a lot different from us. So that would be my expectation.
Another assumption, I think, that goes into the panspermia hypothesis that was proposed, I don't know, in the 1970s or something like that, is that I think they're thinking that something like a bacterial spore, if it landed on an Earth-like planet, would give rise to bacteria, which would then evolve into even intelligent life. So I think there's an assumption that Darwin's theory works, and that the only problem for the naturalist is the origin of life. But we're arguing that that's not the case, that the whole theory is problematic. So I don't see there being I don't think any of the proponents of panspermia would think that all of the species were, that you could have a giraffe launched from another planet and land on Earth and then give rise to giraffes. That's not plausible. What I think is remotely plausible is a bacterial spore, which can exist for a long time and is relatively radiation resistant, and when it encounters the right environment with water, can give rise to bacteria. But that doesn't go anywhere. That wouldn't give you life as we see it. So that would be one answer.
Good evening. I would like to draw your attention to the definition of evolution, because I believe that there is a lot of confusion, that the notion of evolution is not accurate, and even in today's debate, the notion of evolution has been mentioned on multiple occasions, but I'm not sure which definition we refer to, because often we have adaptation in mind, but we say evolution, and there is so much confusion. I feel that it's very difficult for us to be liberated or to move away from the Darwinist bubble. That's one thing, and a comment more than a question. Now, the second comment is that intelligent design is a certain idea that is being carried out in the history of the world. That's the way I understand it. Human life was created at some point in time, but can we speak of evolution at all if we discuss intelligent design? And again, I go back to the definition of evolution. Don't we, or shouldn't we, put some order with respect to the definition of evolution? Because I myself am a little confused.
Yeah. Well, Jay, I mean, that was Jay's talk this morning, was the different meanings. And that definitely does cause a lot of confusion. If people are not careful to distinguish what they're talking about when they use that word, all kinds of confusion results. If you're asking whether well, I'll let Brian answer for himself. Is there a sense in which I think evolution is real? Yes. And there are a couple of the senses that Jay and I think most of us agree that small changes, adaptive changes do occur, and they can even be designed evolution. So I mentioned Michael Behe's book, Darwin Devolves. He's basically saying that you can have complex forms that were made to evolve and adapt into different habitats, the polar bear being one that he talks about. Is that evolution? Yes, but it's designed evolution, and it's evolution that actually loses genetic information. It's not bottom up, something giving rise to all of life.
One more comment. Evolution, according to Darwinists, assumes spontaneous mutation, but not necessarily adaptation, only spontaneous mutation. And that's why I feel confused. Thank you.
Okay, so in the Darwinian framework, you have spontaneous mutation that usually goes nowhere and is weeded out. So it's called purifying selection. But occasionally in the Darwinian framework, these mutations do something that actually helps fitness. And when that happens, they can become the new wild type. They take over the population, and you have a new feature now. This is the Darwinian view. When that happens, that is called adaptation. So adaptation is the process of a living kind changing when a variance within it proved to be beneficial, and they take that kind that species in a new direction. So it's on the issue of how significant adaptation is and what it explains that we disagree. The Darwinist would say adaptation is what gave all forms of life their form. We say adaptation works in a very, very limited sense.
Yeah, and again, language that's helpful can be macro evolution or large-scale evolution or innovative evolution. And we argue that doesn't happen through natural processes. Aquinas talked about that too, but other people are better at that than myself. That only a mind can radically transform something or produce something from scratch. Now, when you talk about small-scale evolution, like bacteria adapting to an antibiotic, finch beaks getting bigger or smaller, that's often referred to as microevolution, small-scale evolution or adaptation. But what's really interesting is even at that level, more and more data is suggesting that it's not random, that organisms are designed to respond in predictable ways, that mutations aren't entirely random, but there's biasing that takes place. Truly random mutations can occasionally be beneficial, but it's rare, and usually it's because you break something. Like if you have a car and you're driving in a very, very dangerous part of the world, if you get into an accident and you can't open your passenger door, that could be beneficial because you won't be carjacked. But no matter how many accidents you get into, you're not going to create anything new. That's kind of how we think about it.
We're running on extra time like a soccer game, so this is the last question. If you can keep it really short, there's still room. No. Just, very short. Who's doing that? Keep it short, please. And
Yes, this is going to be a very short question. The best argument in favor of intelligent design. Let's say that we only have 5 minutes to convince someone.
5 minutes. You give your best and I'll give mine.
Here's my favorite. The origin of life could not have emerged accidentally because it violates every known principle of physics and chemistry. In addition, even the simplest cell represents an automated vehicle with energy production, information processing, active transport. So it represents evidence of design that's so clear that it's irrational to ignore it.
So I approach this in multiple different ways. I mentioned functional coherence this morning. I think whenever you see that pattern, you know that you have something that's highly improbable because all the different parts have to be supporting the same top-level function, and that pattern is present in a remarkable way in life. Another argument that I won't give here, but I've alluded to it, is it can be shown that we are not just physical, that our mind, that we have an immaterial mind, and our brain, our physical brain, is not doing our thinking. That being the case, I'm not arguing here, but it can be shown, and I have argued it. That being the case, no physical process could have produced us because we're not just physical. So that's a very powerful way to show that we cannot be the product of something physical.
ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Douglas Heck, Dr. Brian Miller, thank you so much for your knowledge. Thank you so much for allowing us to put questions on ID. I hope we have more questions than answers. Okay, they say okay. I'm not in charge of that.
Krzysztof Kilian from the Zielona Góra University in Poland. I have a question and a couple of comments. Professor Douglas Axe, you said that scientists, Darwinists, select these testimonies that support their theories and they tend to ignore the rest. I understand that that approach is incorrect. But in the light of what contemporary philosophy says, in fact, it is quite justified, because scientists need to ignore anomalies in the hope that with time they will be neutralized, so to say. I am sure that you're familiar with Imre Lakatos, who said that every theory swims in an ocean of anomalies, and Darwinism swims in an ocean of anomalies, and your theory, once it's more widely disseminated, will also be swimming in an ocean of anomalies. And my other comment is, and Professor Douglas Axe, you talked about it, the Darwinists start from certain assumptions, and those assumptions create their worldview. But in fact, ID proponents do exactly the same, because it's impossible to envisage anything else. So the problem is, well, how do we compare theories that are so very different, like Darwinism and ID? These two theories are completely different, and so it's extremely difficult to compare them. I could speak on and on, but let me move right to the essence, namely both of you, and I also heard it from Professor Behe last year and other ID proponents. Well, you gentlemen sing the same song. Namely, what you say is that we should be following the evidence wherever it leads us. But it's impossible. It is impossible because there is no evidence that would not be theoretical. What you perceive as a piece of evidence for a Darwinist is not. So again, we go back to that highly complex problem of how do we select between the conflicting theories? Because we cannot assume that you are speaking the truth and they are making mistakes, or even worse, they lie, they keep lying to us. It's very difficult for us to decide. Thank you.
Great question.
Yeah, that's a very, very good comments. Will you be here tomorrow? Will you be here tomorrow? Yeah, good. Tomorrow, one of the things I'll do tomorrow is compare what I would consider to be a strong hypothesis in the physical sciences with Darwinism. And I won't give it all away now, but I think there's more to data confirming theories than you suggested. I don't think we're totally at a loss, and that no one can come up with anything that weighs in on one side or the other. I think confirmatory evidence in the history of science has been acquired, and I think that there's hope for that here. But tomorrow, I want to show you how very different, and you can come up to me and have a conversation after, but I want to show you how very, very different the picture looks for the Darwinian synthesis versus a physical theory that is not complete, and there are anomalies, but it has an awful lot that has been established that makes sense. And I'll welcome you to challenge after I present that tomorrow. But okay. I don't think I said, I conceded and do concede that all scientists, including us, do bring assumptions to their science. So I think that's just a part of humans doing work on anything. But I don't think that leaves the situation hopeless for demonstrating that one hypothesis is stronger than another. It does leave people to wonder which, it does leave people to decide whether, in the face of strong evidence, they're willing to walk away from something that they like, and so that involves a human preference. But for observers, for observers who aren't attached to one side or the other, I think there is hope of producing arguments that, to the unbiased observer, really does weigh in on one side or the other. That's what I tried to do in my book, and that's what we're trying to do. Did you want to add to that, Brian?
And what happened, that's a beautiful question, and it is always the challenge of knowledge and truth. But science works, we make progress. And sometimes what happens is you have a really good theory, like Newtonian mechanics, which isn't wrong, but it only operates in a certain realm. So Newtonian mechanics, like what Newton had 500 years ago, is what your car mechanic uses. It's what an engineer uses. But when you get to the very small, you have to go to quantum mechanics. To the very big, general relativity. And other times what happens is a theory wins the day because the evidence becomes so clear. We will not abandon plate tectonics, I guarantee you that. It's just too clear. We'll always believe the Earth goes around the sun and not vice versa. What happens is when you have a good theory, It's like taking off glasses that have a very bad prescription and putting on glasses with a really good prescription. Suddenly the world is much clearer. You can see things better. And we argue, I think with a lot of evidence, that the trend of data is confirming the design predictions and increasingly challenging the idea that it was an accident of nature. Thank you.
Dr. Brian Miller, Dr. Douglas X.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you, Fundacja En Arche, for bringing us this marvelous possibility to put questions, and good answer comes from good question. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.